To this computer. Well, this is the occasional conversational podcast for Theo Fantastique, and I am privileged to have a repeat offender, a returning guest and friend, Brandon R. Grafius. And I'm going to read the bio from the back of his newest book. He is just a publishing machine. He is professor of biblical studies at Ecumenical Theological Seminary in Detroit. He is known for his expertise in the fields of both the Bible and horror, and is a member of the Society of Biblical Literature and the Horror Writers Association, and he lives in Mason, Michigan. Brandon, welcome back.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on again, John. It's good to see you.
It's good to be here. I'm going to put this up
Uh,
so folks can see. And of course, with the video at my blog, theofantastic.com, we'll have a link and description, and I'll include a link to the publisher as well as to Amazon, and folks can order however they would like to
yeah.
do so. And like I said, this is Brandon's latest book, Scared by the Bible, The Roots of Horror in Scripture. And he is prolific in writing on horror and theology related topics. And to begin, I'd like to get a little bit about your origin story. You teach at a seminary, you're teaching biblical studies, you do some theology, but you're also an avid horror fan. Did you grow up with horror and in a Christian home? Did you wrestle with that later on? How do you get from your origin to where you are today?
Yeah, scholars we're like monsters and that we all have origin stories, right?
Right.
That's one of the many ways that we overlap. So yeah, I grew up a horror fan from Scooby-Doo to some of the Disney movies like Something Wicked This Way Comes, and then graduated to the more serious stuff as soon as I could convince my parents to let me rent the VHS tapes. Started with like Hitchcock and things like that, and gradually moved on. And I grew up in looking back on it, it was a fairly progressive Protestant church. At the time, I didn't know anything like that. It was just church. So we would even watch kind of mild horror movies at the church sleepovers and things like that. It didn't ever occur to me that there was a conflict there. It also didn't occur to me that horror would be something you could study seriously. It was, just something kind of fun I did. It wasn't until I was in a seminar in graduate school on apocalyptic literature, reading Anathea Portier-Young's book, Apocalypse Against Empire, and there's a footnote in there about monster theory that references the philosophy of horror by Carroll and Timothy Beale's Religion and Its Monsters, and that kind of blew my mind and got my wheels turning. Around the same time, I was in a seminar on the history of Israel, and we were reading through the Israelite wandering in the deserts and things like that. And I stumbled on Numbers 25 with Phineas murdering the Israelite man and the Midianite woman that he's having amorous relationships with, and it's a death scene that happens in Friday the 13th Part Two. So I was kind of embarrassed to know that, but also thought that was kind of a pretty cool connection. So that kind of got my scholarly wheels turning and starting to think about how can we really look at these two fields in a way that maybe hasn't been done before, in a way that honors both of them and tries to make the argument that they can be really powerful conversation partners.
Fascinating. Now,
Yeah.
since you were in a more progressive Christian tradition, did you ever go through? I went through a process of being in more conservative circles. I was a fan growing up, became a Christian, was in very conservative circles in the past, and then what that was considered inappropriate. So I
No.
kind of left horror to the side for a while, only to embrace it later, and then to discover the scholarship surrounding it, and it was
Yeah.
just to the races from there. Um, but it sounds like it's been a pretty continuous thing for
It
you.
it has. I think the only like small dip would be that I right after my kids were born, I went through a time when I was less open to the violence and the gore, and just didn't want to subject myself to kind of the intensity that you often experience in horror. But then slowly crept my way back, maybe, a couple of years after that.
Now, what was you, like I said at the beginning, you've done a lot of books, and
Yeah.
I'm reading this one, and you're mentioning another book that you got coming out, I think through another one through Oxford. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. I've got another one with, more footnotes than it has pages coming out from Oxford next year.
Okay.
So I really have wanted to try to balance the really, really dense scholarly work with books that kind of find ways to talk about these ideas to broader audiences. That are fun to read, that are affordably priced paperbacks
Yeah.
instead of $100 hardbacks,
Yeah.
and that really work to make these conversations accessible, relevant, and alive. My background is actually in creative writing. Before I took to the study of religion, I did a master's of poetry at UC Davis. My original plan was to be an English professor, and after the master's, I didn't get into the PhD program.
Okay.
So I kind of took that as a, well, you're not cut out to be a scholar, you're done. So I kicked around for a few years. I was a freelance film reviewer. I've got all kinds of stories about being a training coordinator at a telemarketing firm that sold exercise equipment and things like that. And then gradually started to feel the call into ministry. And as I was working on my Master of Divinity degree, started to wonder if maybe the academic door hadn't been completely shut. If that was just a message saying now wasn't the right time. You need to learn a little bit more, reflect a little bit more, grow a little bit more, and then come back.
Yeah. Well, I've been impressed by the different ways in which you write and frame
Oh, thank you.
materials for different audiences. And you also have done an amazing job of finding different publishers to
Oh,
take these on. So what was the origin of how did the idea for this book come about, and how did you connect with Morehouse, the publisher?
yeah. It was an interesting story. So I have been working with an agent for a few years, named Philip Turner, who kind of handles the more, honestly, the books that are going to make any money, for me. So I had put together a proposal trying to figure out what is going to be my next book, and it was kind of trying to be something about how the emotions of horror help us to move to learn more and respond intellectually or things like that. And so we were sending it out to a few publishers and getting some feedback that, oh, it's interesting, but it's not quite right. And Philip knew somebody who was working at church publishing. So he sent it off to them, and Morehouse is their, what would you say, their trade spinoff that they've been launching recently. Morehouse was really excited about the horror thing, and they thought the emotions thing, I don't know, can you revise it for us and do more about horror? And at the same time, Baker Books, an academic religious publisher, said, we're really excited about the emotions part, but not so excited about the horror part. So can you revise it, send us another proposal? So I ended up getting two book contracts out of that initial proposal, one on it spun off in two different directions. So I'm writing that one for Baker right now.
Oh, okay. Great. Yeah, you needed some more writing to do. So
Of course, yeah, I don't have enough, but
now, as I was reading this book again, you've done a good job. You do academic writing, and you also do this popular writing. And who did you have in mind as the audience for this book?
yeah. Um, so I might have been thinking of the audience a little too broadly because I'm trying to do a number of different things. I'm hoping it can speak both to horror fans who maybe have religion in their background or maybe are spiritual in some ways, but not necessarily churchgoers, and at the same time churchgoers who are maybe interested in diving into these things more deeply. I mean, honestly, like the center of the Venn diagram is churchgoers who love horror movies, but I hope to speak to people on either side of that as well. My goal really isn't to convert you either to be a Christian or a horror movie watcher, but I hope that experiencing whichever one of those is a little less comfortable for you will help kind of broaden your horizons in wherever you are comfortable.
Yeah.
Certainly looking for broad readership, so I hope it will be useful for not only pastors but also lay people. Students would be great, but I'm really looking at just people who want to have interesting conversations and think about interesting ideas.
Yeah, would certainly make for an interesting Sunday school curriculum for somebody who is both.
I've heard of at least one pastor who's doing like a book study group with her church on it, so I'm excited to hear how that's going to go.
Okay. Well, I'm
Um,
wondering if there might also be another audience segment. It occurred to me that if you add one more letter to your title, it could be scarred by the Bible. And I'm wondering if it might actually have appeal to those people who, through being involved in the past in forms of church life that they
yeah.
found harmful and the Bible was used in harmful ways, that this might be a means of re-engaging the text that acknowledges the dark elements of it, and yet comes out in a more positive place. What would your thoughts be on that?
I think that would be great. And I hope that people who have that negative experience of church could find a place in this book that is welcoming and accepting of where you are on your journey. I talk at some point about how I'm aware that horror is often used within the church as a way to control, to dominate, to try to make people follow a very narrow set of rules by scaring them into what happens if they don't. And I think that's the least interesting thing that you can do with horror, and also a really small way to look at religion. At one point in the book, I quip that if all you've got in your religion is a list of rules for people to follow, I don't think your religion is very rich or very alive. And usually those rules are rules for other people to follow.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I'm wondering if you could comment on one objection that more conservative Christians and religious people have many times with where horror is concerned, that it's just inappropriate, that the Bible is about positivity and hope and these kinds of things. What would you say to the more conservative minded that might make them more receptive to at least considering what you're diving into in the book?
Yeah. Well, there's a fantastic discussion in Black Phone 2 that's out in the theaters right now, where the conservative camp counselor, the main characters are kind of exploring this murder that happened in this camp years ago. And the camp counselor quotes Philippians at her to say, you're supposed to think on what is good, what is beautiful. And Gwen, the younger sister, says, it also tells you to think on what is true. And I think that's a really, really great response that horror really tries to reach at a truth in our experience. That there are days when it feels like the universe is out to get me. And I am glad to know that my faith ancestors 3,000 years ago sometimes felt that way too. I think that
Yeah.
feels really comforting.
Maybe you've run into this with some of your students, maybe not, depending upon what kind of student population you have. But it seems to me that a lot of Christians that I run into have what I would call a sanitized view of the Bible. They have an idea of what the Bible should be, and then when they read it, it conforms to that presupposition, which prevents them from seeing a lot of the things that you discuss in the book. Is that a helpful way to
I
frame it?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that we have this idea of Bible as a genre,
Right.
and it means a very narrow set of experiences and emotions. That there should always be an uplifting moral, and that the reflection of positive behavior should be relatively uncomplicated. So I love your point about how that often means that people read it and bend it to those presuppositions.
Mhm.
I teach biblical hermeneutics as one of the main courses I teach, which is usually the first Bible course students will take when they come to seminary. And one of the things we work to do is, try to get through those preconceived notions, those embedded theologies, you might say, and try to really get at how do we read the text. And I think if you read it with any kind of an open mind, there's a lot of horror in there. So the question then becomes less, is horror an okay part of our faith or a part of the Bible, and more, well, there's horror here, so what do we do with it?
Mhm. Well, let's get into some examples of this that you cover in your book. Can you share a few examples of horror and then connect the dots to the sacred text? And then what kinds of things should we be taking away from those kinds of things when we bring them together?
Yeah. Um, I For me, the what horror does best is also what religion does best, which is open your open your imagination up to view the world in a different way, to help us enlarge in our sense of what is possible. And that's how we begin to think about what the divine is, even though we'll never get all the way there. And I think that's what horror does for us too. So I look at things like I think there's plenty of cosmic horror in the Bible. The book of Job is maybe the clearest large scale example, but I spent some time talking just about the tiny incident in 2 Samuel 6 when there's a procession of the ark into Jerusalem, and Uzzah reaches out to touch the ark because it looks like it's going to topple over. And as soon he doesn't want to hit the ground, and as soon as he touches it, he dies. He's just struck dead, and David is really angry about that. So I connect that with my memories of the cosmic horror of the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, which I read as basically an action movie that has cosmic horror tapped onto it at the end. This idea that you are confronted with a reimagining of everything you thought you know about how the world works and your place in it. So I think of that as kind of a helpful counterbalance to things like Genesis 1:26, where we're made in the image of God in a really beautiful way, but we've also been given dominion over all the animals and everything else on the earth. And if we're not careful, that can lead us to domination and exploiting and just viewing the resources of this earth as being here for our benefit to use in whatever way we see fit. And that's one of the main drivers of our environmental crisis is that we have read that passage for thousands of years to give us that kind of license. I think the Bible has its own antibodies for that if we're willing to look for it.
Hmm. Yeah, I was asked recently to review a book for the Journal of Religion and Popular Culture, and then they expanded it to two because there's similar books. It's going to be interesting as they're juxtaposed, but one of them, the author in the past, as a Christian author, has written, and it seems like in this book, he wants to argue that horror, contemporary horror, has really twisted Christian themes and ideas. Now, that is certainly a part of horror, but do you think that's all that's going on with contemporary horror when it engages with Christianity, or is it broader than that?
It's definitely broader than that. And there are some horror movies that do that. There are also horror movies like The Conjuring that are basically apologetics for a really traditional form of Christianity. And then movies like Midnight Mass or extended Netflix series like Midnight Mass that take the biblical text and use that as a launching point to have some really, really deep theological conversations. I think horror is like most genres that a lot of it isn't very good, and a lot of it doesn't work. I think that's true of any genre, whether it's fantasy or comedy or art house films or serious literature. A lot of it's not great. So if we're stuck in a position where we have to defend every single horror movie that's ever been made, we're probably going to lose that battle.
Right.
I have no need to do that. But I think there is a lot of horror that really engages seriously with these questions. I love the quote from another repeat offender of yours, Douglas Cowan, who remarks that horror is the genre that takes religion at its word.
Hmm.
I think that's really, really evocative.
Yeah. Um, I was really just fascinated by the book as I read it, and it
Thank you.
connected dots for me that it's really strange. I mean, I'm into horror. I also do theology and this kind of thing, but for some reason, I tend to keep, unless I'm really making a concerted effort, those two things are in separate spheres. It's like you're doing
Yeah.
theological studies or biblical studies on the one hand, and then horror studies or monster theory on the other. Do you have any suggestions for how folks might help bring those more naturally into conversation with each other?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's what I've been trying to work on for the last dozen years of my scholarly career. Um, and I think for me, kind of I don't know if it's not quite a light bulb moment because it's been more gradual than that, but to recognize that you've heard the truism that every great story is about something and about something else. And this is true in the Bible and also true in horror. So it's often that something else that you find. You've got a story here in the Bible and a story here in horror, and both of them are speaking to this same anxiety, the same fear, the same question. And that's where the fireworks can really, really start to spark.
Do you see much of a difference between ancient fears that you've studied in the Bible and contemporary fears as expressed in horror? Is it just cultural differences, or
Mhm.
any thoughts on that?
That's a really great question. There are certainly cultural differences, and I think there are some that sometimes our culture is so radically different that those cultural differences are really broad. Like the economic anxieties that you find in haunted house movies would look just really different in contemporary American society versus ancient Israel. But a lot of them are still the same. I think most ghost stories are propelled by this anxiety over what's been wrong in the past and how we bring that to light and how we make an attempt to make it right. And I think that's the same anxiety we see in stories like the Ghost of the Book of Samuel. Or um, so I really do think a lot of these anxieties are just deeply human.
Hmm.
And I want to both honor the specificity of that. I don't think flattening them out and saying they're exactly the same is helpful. But at the same time, there's a lot of commonalities.
As I read your book, I heard echoes of another writer, a friend of ours, Steve Wiggins,
Yeah.
who has argued that the roots of contemporary horror can, at least in part, be traced back to the biblical literature. Did you have that in the back of your mind as you were writing?
Absolutely. I know I mentioned him a couple of times in my publisher told me no footnotes. We don't want any footnotes.
Right.
So I put together a narrative bibliography at the end that's, like 15 pages of kind of a story of some of the sources that were helpful for me. And I give the readers permission to say, if you've gotten this far and you want to say you've finished the book, you have my permission to check it off your list. That's okay. But hopefully it's still kind of a fun, look under the hood at some of these questions. And Wiggins is one of the scholars that really is there a lot. I think both his idea that the roots of the horror genre are really in the Bible and the other ancient Near Eastern literature right around there, and also this idea that he refers to the Bible as the good book. As kind of a weighted, loaded term, meaning that we only allow good in our interpretation of it.
Yeah.
Um,
I appreciated that narrative bibliography, if you will, at the end.
yeah.
And I had most of the books, but there were a couple that I did not. So I'm going to blame you for two recent book purchases that have come from the last
Apologies.
few days.
You can send me the receipts if you need
Okay,
to.
there you go. I like that. That'll work. What is a major takeaway you want readers to have with this book?
So I really hope that readers will come away from it being able to reflect on a little bit of the things that really drive their own spirituality. That some of those chapters at least will kind of cause a connection and okay, this is something that is important to me about my faith that I really hadn't quite put my finger on. I do think about these things and use these kind of rituals as a way to work through these questions. So I hope it will lift that up to the surface. Whether you're a churchgoer or not, I think these questions are, as Douglas Cowan again says, deeply human questions. And then I also hope it will help readers become better viewers, consumers of horror. Even maybe open a little bit more to it, or maybe just being willing to look a little deeper to see what might be driving the horror movies that they already love.
Well, my hope through this conversation was to have folks get to know you a little bit better, to get just a
Yeah.
feel for this book. So hopefully they'll pick up a copy. But I need to ask at the end, is there anything you wish I would have asked that I did
Ah.
to get out there?
Oh, your questions are great. I was realizing that one thing that is really I think important to me about this book and really fun that I hope will entice readers. As I was working on the introduction for it, this was back in the book proposal phase. I needed to put together an introductory chapter so publishers would kind of see what I'm thinking of. And it occurred to me, well, what would it look like if I took the story that I'm talking about and started by retelling it like it was a campfire ghost story? So I have in the introduction just like a two-page kind of um, story version of the scene in Genesis 32 where Jacob and the angel at the riverbank wrestle with each other, the angel or God or Jacob's doppelganger or whoever that might be, kind of retold as a late night campfire horror story. And I enjoyed that so much that I decided to start every chapter off with one of those and see how that would go. Um, I thought it was really fun, and I hope readers respond to it as just kind of a way to read these texts differently, or if you're unfamiliar with them, to maybe approach them from that angle of story. I've also, in my spare time, been writing a novel that I just finished a first draft of that I hope will be out in the world sometime soon. So this was kind of my test run for doing some fiction writing.
Wow, very nice. My friends are so talented. I think Doug Cowan's now working on some, now that he's retired, working on some nonfiction writing.
He mentioned
Or
that.
film
Yeah.
writing. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that he's got some short stories or maybe even a novel he's working on.
yeah.
And then Kendall Phillips just published his first novel, if you know his
Oh, okay.
horror
Yeah,
scholarship work. Yeah.
yeah, definitely. Wow. That's too much to keep up on here. So
Yeah. Of the making of books, there is no end.
that's right.
Yes.
That's right. Well, Brandon, thank you so much for coming on and making the time in a busy schedule. I know you've been doing a lot of book promotion and you got a lot going on, but I really appreciate it. And I want to again direct folks to the narrative that will accompany this video with Theo Fantastique, and they'll have a description and a link to your bio and a link to where they can pick up a copy of the book. And I encourage folks to do it because it's a great read. Thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on, John. I always love these conversations with you.
Well, until the next book promotion. Thanks.
Sounds good.